Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 14 in our examination and response and refutation of Kenneth Gentry's book, Have We Missed the Second Coming? I've been sharing with you some thoughts and some, quote, arguments, unquote, as Dr. Gentry set out to prove that Matthew chapter 24 and 25 speaks of two different events. Number one, he acknowledges that Christ came at the end of the age in judgment. There was a resurrection and the new heaven and the new earth, and the wedding of Christ occurred in AD 70. Now, I can document, I'm not going to take the time to document from page numbers and what have you, but I do that in my books, all right? But although Dr. Gentry agrees that all of those things happened in AD 70, he says that AD 70 was a type, a shadow of the real end. And you can see my book, AD 70, A Shadow of the Real End, question mark, on my website, www.donkpreston.com. or BibleProphecy.com. I completely refute the idea that AD 70 was a shadow of anything. It was the end. It was the day of the Lord. Okay, one of the ways that Dr. Gentry seeks to prove that Matthew 24 and 25 speaks of two different events, the AD 70 coming of the Lord and a yet future coming of the Lord at the, quote, end of human history, unquote, is because in the way that he thinks, and as he writes on page 79, in all of the verses leading up to verse 34 and 36, what we find is a reference to those days, as it shall be in those days. So according to Dr. Gentry, we have reference to those days, but in verse 36, we have a reference to that day. So, Dr. Gentry, in his theology, absolutely demands that those days cannot be a reference to AD 70, or excuse me, those days do refer to AD 70, but they cannot refer to that day. Because that day, according to his philosophy, establishes a contrast. And it's a singular day as opposed to those days. Now, I have to tell you, first of all, I used to make that argument. I used to believe that was valid. But I believe a closer contextual look, not only at this text, but also a parallel text, absolutely destroys that idea. But first of all, you have to understand that Dr. Gentry, in this argument, is basing his entire argument on his foundational presupposition. And that presupposition is that in Matthew 24, verse 3, when the disciples asked, in response to Jesus' prediction of the fall of Jerusalem, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming," your parousia, literally your presence, "and of the end of the age?" I've already shared with you that Dr. Gentry believes, and it's absolutely critical to his view, that the disciples mistakenly linked the fall of Jerusalem with Jesus' coming at the end of human history. Dr. Gentry believes, point number 2, that the disciples believed that the temple would not fall or be destroyed until the end of human history. I've demonstrated that is simply false. But keep in mind, this presupposition, pardon me, is absolutely critical. Now, the point of fact is, folks, that the Greek word parousia, the sign of your coming, is used by Josephus, first century contemporary of Paul, to speak of the in-history comings of the Lord in the Old Testament. the Lord came. His presence was manifested when he used one army to destroy another. Now that's the historical background of the use of parousia. For Dr. Gentry to just assume, without offering us any proof, that the word parousia in Matthew 24 and verse 3 is being used of the, quote, end of human history, flies in the face of the well-documented use of parousia in not only Josephus, but as well as other historical sources as well, and as proven by the use of the word prosopon in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, that spoke of the Lord's presence when he used one army to destroy another. Now, all of that's critical to understand Dr. Gentry's presupposition that he brings to verse 36. He assumes, without proof, that the disciples had actually asked, or that Jesus had actually ever taught a doctrine such as the end of human history. Now then, I've got to hurry. What about this argument that we have a these days versus that day contrast? Well, let's see. In Matthew chapter 24, in the verses that Dr. Gentry agrees and teaches applies to AD 70, we find all of these references to those days, except those days be shortened. Even the elect should perish, verse 22. So, notice now, we have those days. Watch, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, folks, these are the events leading up to the final fall. These are the events of those days, the days of what? The days of the abomination of desolation. The days of the preaching of the gospel into all the world, even. Because those are the two key signs of the end that the disciples had asked about. So, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the heaven, the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and that's not a visible sign in the sky. Okay, anyway. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Well, let me ask, is this coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, would it not occur on a given day? Would it not be the climax of those days? I mean, that's after all what the text says. Immediately after those days, this will happen. Folks, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, is the climax to those days. That's what verse 29 teaches. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Here's the climax. The coming of the Son of Man. Oh, but that's not all. Notice in verse 36 and following, or verse 37 and following, as the days of Noah were, so also is the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the coming of the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day. Oh, wait a minute. Here is those days leading up to the day. Why isn't those days in the verses before 36 leading up to the day of verse 29 and 30? Why are those not the same, those days and that day? Now, let me drive that home very, very quickly. In Luke chapter 17, we find the prediction, and by the way, when you go down to Luke chapter 17, 20 through 37, you'll find exact parallels to Matthew 24. Exact parallels. Watch this. As the lightning flashes out of one part under heaven and shines to the other part under heaven, so also the Son of Man will be in His day. Now wait a minute. That's taken from Matthew 24:26. So we have those days and that day, his day. Now watch this. But first what? Before the day of the Son of Man. He, Son of Man, Jesus, must suffer many things, be rejected by this generation. Now folks, there's your time statement. You know, first he must suffer, then he will come. That's this generation. But anyway, as it was, now watch this, catch the power of this, as it was in the days of Noah, so also it will be in the days, plural, of the Son of Man. Now, Dr. Gentry says, no. Jesus was not talking about days of the Son of Man. He only talked about the day of the Son of Man. Not according to Jesus in Luke 17, but we continue. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day. Now these are the days leading up to the day. This is Matthew 24:37, which is supposed to refer to the final coming of the Lord. Likewise, as it was also in the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them. Watch this. So it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day. When? When the Son of Man is revealed. Let the one who is on the housetops and his goods are in the house, don't let him come down to take them away. Let him escape. Do you see that in Luke chapter 17, Jesus uses those days and that day to refer to the time in which, they would be on their housetops. That's from Matthew 24, and the section that Kenneth Gentry agrees refers to AD 70, or the events leading up to AD 70. It refers to those days leading up to that day of AD 70. This so-called distinction between those days and that day is therefore absolutely, completely, and totally refuted by an examination of Luke chapter 17. Now remember, Luke 17, Matthew 24 are directly parallel. There are verses in Luke 17 that are directly parallel to Matthew 24 in the section that Gentry agrees applied to the events leading up to AD 70. But it calls it those days leading up to that day, when the Son of Man would be revealed. The Son of Man would be revealed when they would be on the housetops and they were told to flee, not even to take the time to come back into their house to get their goods. Why? Because destruction was coming. Remember Lot's wife. Don't look back. Escape. Flee. Everything about Luke chapter 17 absolutely, totally refutes Kenneth Gentry's attempted distinction between the Lord's coming at the climax of those days in AD 70 and his claimed distinction between that day. No, Luke chapter 17 undeniably, unequivocally, and irrefutably speaks of those days leading up to that day of AD 70. And thus, once again, one of Kenneth Gentry's foundational, fundamental, and necessary arguments for dividing Matthew 24 falls to the ground. Well, thank you so much for joining me for our video number 14 in response to Kenneth Gentry. Let me urge you, go to my website, get my book, AD 70, A Shadow of the Real End, ? In which I demonstrate beyond any doubt that AD 70 is never posited, never spoken of as a type or a shadow of anything else. You'll be amazed at the power of the evidence. Well, again, thank you so much. Hope you have an absolutely fantastic weekend. Hope to see you on Monday.